Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. I think one of the things that most disappoints, or most, at least, befuddles a lot of modern observers of Norse myth is how scattered the real sources are. If we read the poems of the Poetic Edda, and if most of them really are datable to the Viking Age, we find that they're not from the same place, they're not from the same time, they're not by the same people or people who probably even knew each other. Instead, they are scattered attestations of particular regional, probably forms of particular beliefs. And also, on the whole, even among, people who might have shared the same beliefs, we have to remember that these myths aren't necessarily a reflection of the desire to make a systematic explanation of nature, but rather to tell stories about nature. So there's not always going to be an answer to every question we can ask about Norse myth, and there's not always necessarily going to be an easy way to even number, for example, how many gods there are. It's interesting, it's Snorri Sturluson, who of course in a way is a secondary source. He's writing in the 1200s, trying to make sense of the same poems and some additional poems that we don't have. He tries to make a list of 12 Aesir gods in Gylfaginning, the first part of the Prose Edda. And in fact, he ends up listing 14. He says these are Odin, Thor, Baldur, Njordr, Freyr, Tyr, Bragi, Heimdallr, Hodr, Vidar, Voli, Ullr, Forseti, and Loki. Now, probably the desire to make 12 is based on the old tradition that there's 12 Olympians. And often, both classical writers and medieval writers want to make all sets of pagan gods basically identical to the Greco-Roman gods, right? It's all, as far as they're concerned, a reflection of one thing, which is paganism, the wrong religion, as contrasted with Christianity. Or from a classical perspective, it's all worship of the same gods, just under different names in different regions. It's probably not a very old tradition in the North that there's actually 12 gods. And note, Snorri doesn't even list 12 here, he lists 14. It's also interesting that he makes another effort to list 12 in Skóldskaparmál, in which he does manage to list 12, but he does it by leaving out Odin, Baldur, and Hodr from this list in Gylfaginning, and then adding Hunir, who is, of course, a very mysterious figure who occurs in the story of the creation according to Völuspá, will survive Ragnarok according to Völuspá, and also wanders with Odin and Loki in the prose matter that precedes Regnsmál that gets used in the Saga of the Volsungs. It's also notable that Snorri makes a list of 14 goddesses, and, probably this is out of a desire to be more or less symmetrical with the list of the gods, but very few of these are ever mentioned outside of Snorri's list, or if they are, they're clearly just other names for Frigg and Freya. So among his 14 goddesses, he lists Frigg, he lists Freya, but he also lists Sága, who is known only from the mention in Grímnismál 7 that there's a place called Súkvabekkr where she and Odin drink all day. That's all. He mentions an Eir, who's supposed to be a healer. She's known from a list of names in Fjolsvinnsmál. That's all outside of Snorri's list. There's Gefjun. He says she's a virgin in this list. Probably Gefjun is a real separate goddess in this tradition. She comes up in Lokasenna. She's a separate goddess there. There's also the frame story that Snorri uses about her in Gylfaginning, which suggests that there's probably something real in the history about her. Fulla, who is also mentioned by Snorri, she's mentioned in the prose introduction of Grímnismál. She's mentioned in Lokasenna, and also she's mentioned apparently in the second Merseburg charm in Old High German. So we can believe that this is probably an old servant of Frigg, probably. The goddess Snorri mentions as the goddess of love, Sjofn, is known from nowhere but this list by Snorri. And so I am asked all the time by people who want to know who Sjofn is, or who want to, quote unquote, correct me when I say that Freya is a goddess associated with love. They say, no, Sjofn is the goddess of love. Well, only Snorri says that, only here, and that name never comes up anywhere else, or if it does, I cannot find it. Another one that he mentions right after that that's never mentioned anywhere else is Lofn, who supposedly is the one who gives permission for things like romantic unions. Again, we don't know her outside of Snorri's list. Then there's Vor, who is a goddess of wedding vows, apparently. This probably is a real tradition. She's mentioned in Thrymskvida 30. Bless us together in the name of Vor is what is said when the hammer is brought in to touch Thor when he's supposedly the bride who's going to marry the giant Thrymr. And then her name is used in a kinning and Helreið Brynhildar, stanza 2, where Brynhildar herself is called Vor Guls, the goddess Vor of gold. The common way of referring to women is to use a goddess's name and then some kind of jewelry. Then we have another goddess mentioned, Vor, with the short vowel, who is supposed to be very wise. Her name means aware, not known outside of Snorri's list. There's Sun, whose name means denial, also unknown outside of Snorri's list here. There's Hlín, who is obviously a name of Frigg when that name comes up in Völuspá 52. Tho kemur Hlínar harmar annar fram. Then Hlínar's second sorrow comes forward. This is talking about the death of Odin, when we've seen previously in stanza 33 that Frigg wept for the death of Baldur. So that's her first sorrow. Her second sorrow is the death of Odin in stanza 52. And of course, the name Hlín is used for her because it alliterates with Harmar. And then Snotra, supposedly a goddess of wisdom, unknown at sort of Snorri's list here, and Gno, mentioned only in a lost poem that I have cited in a different video in my own translation from my forthcoming translation of the Prose. So keep in mind that Snorri himself is trying to make this more systematic than it really is. He is attributing attributes to these names that probably are just alternative names of Frigg and Froya, or maybe just names he saw in a place name, like Ságanes, Peninsula of Sága, which is mentioned in one of the Helgi poems, and assume this must be some kind of separate deity with a separate narrative tradition about her, when we really just don't know what that tradition might have been, if there was any, and I'm generally pretty doubtful that most of these were separate goddesses in pre-Christian Norse myth. I hope if this has been somewhat interesting or informative for you and helping to inform your perspective on Norse mythology, that you'll check out some of my other videos. I also have a Patreon, and of course, I'm a translator of the Norse myths. I've translated the Poetic Edda, the Sága of the Volsungs, and in the near future, my translation of the Prose Edda, as well as of the Saga of Rolf Kraki with the Saga of Hervor and Haedrek, will be coming out from Hackett Publishing, the publisher of my previous 2 books. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.